Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for a discussion of what was the Chinese Revolution and where is it going, hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. Platypus hosts reading groups and public fora like this one toward the possible reemergence of a critical Marxist left with emancipatory social intent. If you'd like to get involved in the Platypus chapter near you, send an email to coordinator@platypus1917.org. You can check out our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, our YouTube channel, and the Platypus Review, our forum and print for a conversation on the left. If you'd like to respond in writing to this panel or an issue raised in it, please send an email to editor.platypusreview@gmail.com. So, a quick introduction of our panelists. Mike Belbin is a writer for the Weekly Worker and New Interventions. Carl Davidson was a vice president and national secretary of the Students for a Democratic Society, an editor and writer for The Guardian, and co-chair and field organizer of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. Hans-Peter Breitman is a member of the Bolshevik Tendency, and Kevin Lin is a Hong Kong-based labor activist and researcher. So for the panel discussion prompt that we'll be discussing today, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. A century after its founding, what is the importance of the CCP and its history to the left? What was the Chinese Revolution, and what are the important historical moments? For example, the Revolution of 1925 to 27, the 1949 Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, and 1980s reform in the history of Chinese communism in relation to the international left that task the left today. What does the Chinese Revolution tell us about the relationship between the state, the party, and the revolution? So our panelists will each have 10 minutes for introductory remarks, after which 3 minutes or so to respond to each other. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So, Mike, do you want to take us away?
Yep. Thanks, Kevin, for inviting me onto this discussion. I hope what I say will be penetrating and interesting to people, and I look forward to them talking about the revolution, Chinese Revolution as well to me. Okay, how is it that the Chinese Communist Party is still there when the Soviet Union and other state Marxist societies have gone? Why is it so firm in its resolve, yet flexible enough to survive? A veritable platypus of capitalist and socialist characteristics. To pinpoint the foundations of the Chinese CP, we have to go back to its very formation in 1921 and beyond, and consider, one, international attitudes towards the use of the state economically. Two, domestic attitudes to the state, especially in Chinese reform movements at the turn of the 20th century. And lastly, the lack of a substantial working class as a popular basis for the communists, with the adaptation of Marxism to this. Since the 7th century BCE, we know from documents that the Chinese have always assumed a close relationship between the state and society. Confucius, for one, promoted an ethic of proper behavior within an overall hierarchy, from court to village. But like Emperor Ashoka of India and Constantine in Europe, he wished to affect conduct, not the mode of production. In the late 19th century, China, while dominated by foreign firms, tried to build up self-strengthening, particularly by investing in an arms industry. One Asian society that set an example was Japan, which under pressure to modernize had set up a combination of the state and large firms. Like Germany, it was a second league capitalist power that found the key to rapid modernization in the state, in state-led modernization. This, of course, was a distortion of classical capitalism and the law of value, but not a suppression of it, as would occur in China and the Soviet Union. In the China of the early 20th century, however, the concern of reformers was with the culture that held China back. One reformer, Liang, a teacher, went in 1903 to the United States in order to study, amongst other things, the Chinese immigrant community. He found not the active citizens he was seeking, but politically passive traditionalists. Even in San Francisco, he wrote, they were too attached to the village, region, and the ancient culture. He went on, we can only accept despotism and cannot enjoy freedom. If we were to accept a democratic system of government now, it would be nothing less than committing suicide. The Communist Party was founded in 1921 as part of a general response to the Versailles Treaty. Chen, one of its founders, admired Liang and other reformers for their focus on changing the Chinese mind and aiming to establish a strong national state. Mao Zedong in 1935 confessed to Edgar Snow that as a young man he had worshipped these thinkers and had read and reread their works. In February 1927, it was Mao who prepared a report on Hunan province, where the peasantry had risen against the warlords and government forces. Mao concluded, several 100 million peasants in China's central, southern, and northern provinces will rise like a fierce wind, a tempest, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to suppress it. He would often fall back on such spontaneity later, as in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, though not to the extent of rejecting the party's leading role. In April of the same year as Mao's report, the party's rival in nationalism, Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang, decided he wanted no more allies on the left, either inside or outside his organization. In Shanghai and Wuhan, he conducted the first purge, elimination of people for reasons of political faction. In April, there were hundreds of arrests and executions among these islands of the working class. The communists left the cities and began to work in the countryside. The result was the party based itself on the peasantry rather than the working class. When in China in 1978, Deng Xiaoping became leader and introduced market practices, he was continuing the Chinese flexibility that came with not being a class-based politics, but a national politics of mental reconstruction. Mao's concept of contradiction also showed how flexible, how opportunist a state Marxist can be. In his essay on contradiction of 1937, he writes of non-antagonistic contradictions. That is, for example, a contradiction between town and country, which under a socialist society may not change, which means that it's no longer very serious. In the 1940s, with the lack of a strong Chinese capitalism and domestic state in the face of imperialism, the party managed to seize power. And ever since, it has managed to wield it arrogantly and indeed recklessly. But it now suffers the same challenge as in the West from an educated and resentful public. This makes for instability, if not revolution. And as in the capitalist state countries, because control had seemed so much easier not so long ago, the loss of it is liable to make the rulers tetchy. The party's foundation and experience then contains a lesson we might well learn from. When the party is cut off from the class a party which sees achieving hegemony as imposing mind control rather than, as Antonio Gramsci saw it, a creative educational experience, then they do so at the risk of becoming an autocracy. Thank you. Was that 10 minutes?
You still got some time. But if those were your remarks, thank you very much, Mark.
Okay.
So now I'll move to Carl. Wait, Carl, you need to unmute. There we go.
One thing I try to do in approaching the question of China and others like it is to challenge or tell people they have to set aside what I call a kind of left Neoplatonism. And the reason, what I mean by that is the years 1917 to say 1923 in Russia are defined as real socialism. That's the idea, the Platonic ideal of what socialism is. And so then, with that in your mind, you go around and you try to fit everything to try to match that Platonic ideal. And you can come up with all kinds of different things: deformed worker states, degenerate worker states, all sorts of deviations from the Platonic ideal of everything that happened in the USSR from 1917 to 1923. So the first wisdom, I think, is to just take that and put it in brackets and set it aside and try to look at China and its leadership in its own terms. Mao and all the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party early on were part of a youth movement, the May 4th movement. It was rising up, and their idea is that they wanted to modernize China, to bring modern ideas into it, and to break with a lot of the older thinking, to make China its own independent force. They had a number of influences, Sun Yat-sen being one of them in the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. Also, interestingly, John Dewey went over there during that period and actually gave lectures on democracy and so on at Beijing University when Mao was working in the library. I have no proof that Mao actually attended his lectures, but I imagine that he probably would have. Many of the radical Chinese youth at the time did. So from the beginning, you begin to see that the one thing that Chinese communism is about liberating the Chinese nation. And in order to do it, you have to understand the reality of the forces that exist in China. One of the questions you pose is the 1927 revolutions, which I learned about by studying a book that was put out back in the 70s called Armed Insurrection by A. Newberg. There was no such thing as A. Newberg. It was a made-up name of the commentator. But it did in-depth studies of the so-called the Soviets in Canton and other major cities where there was a working class upsurge at the time. I came to the conclusion that all this was very fascinating. I said, but it didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of succeeding. Since the Chinese working class was so exceedingly small in relation to the entire population and problems of China. And that as long as they pursued this route, they would face defeat after defeat. And they did. And so finally, at one point, Mao Zedong gathered up and began to build a people's army and had a different idea. He had done an analysis of classes in Chinese society, and he began to see the peasantry as the main force. And to do that, they also needed what he called the three magic weapons: the party, the United Front, and the army. And so he proceeded to build all three, especially the People's Army, which meant in the circumstances he faced, of facing Chiang Kai-shek's armies and other warlords, he had to make a massive strategic retreat, which was the Long March. The Long March, many things. But one thing it was a training ground and a hardening of a core of revolutionary fighters. They started off with 100,000 people and only ended up with about 10,000 people by the time they reached Yan'an. But there, Mao set up a school, basically a training school, and where he conducted not only his own education, his own continuing studies into the reality of China, but he built up his army so that, and he engaged in united fronts on and off, and he engaged in battles, and they kept losing them and losing them and losing them and moving about, and he kept losing in battles until he won. And that was a part of the slogan he had: fight, fail, fight again, fail again until our victory. And he codified all this and summed it up in the strategy and tactics of protracted people's war, which is something new under the sun for Marxism. And in this period is when I think Mao was at his most brilliant, and it led to the 1949 revolution. After the taking of power, Mao's record is, mixed. And he did some things very well, other things very poorly. He was experimenting. There was no orthodoxy as to how to proceed. The Soviet Union had done some things, but then, they were no great success at it. Mao was also basically his own thinker, the Comintern had tried to intervene and give him all sorts of guidance and advice along the way. And basically, his idea was to send Stalin a birthday card and thank him for his guns and money, but basically take his advice and throw it into the garbage can. And you can say that, they won mainly by ignoring Stalin's advice. Anyway, the ups and downs of the period then, it led him to launch the Cultural Revolution he felt that the class struggle continued under socialism, which is a very good idea. Socialism is a mixed society, still had many classes in it. And he tried to fight the backward ideas and bombard the headquarters in the party. I'll try to shorten things a bit. When I came back, I've been to China a couple of times, and one time I came back, my mother asked me, well, what was it like? I said, well, Mom, it was like walking into the future and the past at the same time. I said, the basic reality of China was a village in the countryside. 90% of China, at least when I was there. Now it's much different. And I said, when I went to these villages, I saw old women working as beasts of burden, much the same way they had 5,000 years ago, from sunup to sundown. I said at the same time in these villages, they had established equality for women. They had a children's palace, no matter how small, in every village. They took care of the children and gave them great educational opportunities and so on. So what is this contradiction? How does this translate to a level of abstraction? It's a contradiction between backward productive forces and advanced social relations. So who was it who said that this was the main contradiction in China? It wasn't Mao Zedong, it was Liu Shaoxi and Deng Xiaoping. Mao was arguing that the main contradiction was between the bourgeoisie and the party and, the people, broadly speaking. And he played the Cultural Revolution out until finally it came to disaster. Whatever good intentions and positive things it made established early on, in the end, it brought China to the brink of civil war. And luckily, through Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, Mao had finally had fired Deng Xiaoping down to the bottoms and finally brought him back. Deng Xiaoping is actually a very good Marxist. Most people have never read him. I have. Anyway, when he came back and through Zhou Enlai, he managed to start China on accomplishing the tasks of the bourgeois revolution, which was to industrialize China and create a proletariat. And through his reforms and a mixed economy, that's what he's done. So China is now finally a country where 50% of the workforce are proletarians. So if you want to build socialism, this matters. It matters a great deal. And the Chinese party, by also attending to improving people's living conditions, has maintained the mandate of heaven. The vast majority of the people support it. And it's moving forward with considerable successes, as we can see. Thank you. That sums up my.
Thank you so much, Carl. And now Hans Peter.
Okay. When the Chinese Communist Party was founded in Shanghai in 1921, it was inspired by the National Liberation Movement of May 1919, but more importantly, by the 1917 Russian Revolution. The early Communist International asked it to send some of its best prospects to Moscow, where they witnessed the faction fight after Lenin's death in April 1924. This was about the orientation not just of the Russian Communist Party, but given the prestige that it had gained by leading the October Revolution, also about the future of the communist parties across the globe in the shape of the Comintern. In light of the defeats of revolutions in Hungary, Italy, and Germany in the early 1920s, the prospects of socialist world revolution seemed to be drifting away. And this in turn triggered a change in course around the bureaucratizing Stalinist majority of the Communist Party, which out of fear of further imperialist military interventions and exhaustions after a year of civil war and economic devastation, opted for the retrograde policy of socialism in one country, thereby abandoning Lenin's orientation towards world revolution. The Communist Party now controlled the distribution of wealth within the framework of a still impoverished society in Russia. Party members, particularly in the upper echelons, could appropriate an undue share of the social wealth for their own personal benefit. In this, Leon Trotsky saw the material foundation for the Soviet Union's bureaucratic degeneration, which resulted in the political expropriation of the proletariat's role in the state. The policy of socialism in one country, with its basis in bureaucratic pessimism of the possibility of international revolution, was accompanied by an orientation of peaceful coexistence with imperialism. This new orientation led Moscow to view the Communist parties primarily as local instruments of its foreign policy needs. Invoking peaceful coexistence as a viable long-term prospect was aimed at reassuring the imperialist world that the Communist parties in their countries would no longer pose a revolutionary threat. In many cases, the Communist parties were instructed to drop revolutionary activity in favor of class collaborationist policies, which paralleled those of the Mensheviks prior to the October Revolution. Developments in the Soviet Union had a direct impact on the events in China in 1926 to 27. There was considerable ferment, as other speakers have commented, among the peasantry and the numerically small but militant proletariat, mostly concentrated in Shanghai, which engaged in uprisings against the warlords who acted as compradors for multiple imperialist powers. The Comintern instructed the small Chinese Communist Party to enter into an alliance with the bourgeois nationalists of the Kuomintang, which amounted to the complete political subordination of the communists to the Kuomintang leadership, including seizing publication of its own press in order to not offend its bourgeois partners. As opposed to this, Trotsky proposed that the Chinese proletariat led by the CCP should seek to ally with the poor peasantry with the aim to overthrowing the bourgeoisie, the warlords, and their imperialist masters. In order to achieve this, Trotsky advised the Communist Party to retain its political independence from the Kuomintang. In April 1927, for a brief period, workers took control of Shanghai, which shocked the Kuomintang leaders. Stalin ordered the Chinese communists who led this action to disarm their supporters and surrender Shanghai to the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang responded by massacring the Shanghai workers. The result of this was that the CCP became a peasant-based party. Many of the Chinese students in the Soviet Union, as well as some CCP cadre in the cities who survived the massacre, including founding members, more or less came over to Trotskyism. The most prominent one was CCP leader Chen Tu-Siu. Despite its best efforts to maintain the cordial relations with the Kuomintang, the CCP was hunted down by the supposed allies. It entered into a protracted guerrilla war against Japanese imperialism and the warlords, and after World War II managed to overthrow the corrupt Kuomintang regime headed by Chiang Kai-shek, whose survivors fled to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. In doing so, Mao ignored Stalin's repeated advice and instructions not to take power. After pretending to establishing a democracy of the four classes for a brief period, the failure to obtain cooperation from any significant fragment of the capitalists led the CCP to nationalize the economy and establish a deformed worker state modeled after Stalin's Soviet Union. In the late 1950s, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward in an attempt to accelerate economic growth. It was a huge failure that led the CCP into an inter-bureaucratic faction fight. When Deng advocated the adoption of some market elements, Mao responded by initiating the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution against capitalist rulers. At the same time as China was undergoing this enormous internal conflict, relations with the Soviet Union became embittered. After the 1969 border clash with the USSR, the Chinese regime proclaimed Soviet social imperialism to be more dangerous than US imperialism, leading to direct alignment with Washington. As a reliable partner for Washington in its Cold War efforts against the Warsaw Pact states, Deng took the nationalist essence of socialism in one country to its extreme when he invaded Vietnam in early 1979, which was exercising its own version of socialism in one country. Tensions between Vietnam and China over energy exploration and fishing rights continue to this day. These events, like the bitter hostility between China and the USSR, highlight how far the Stalinist dogma is from genuine communism. Marx and Lenin strove for countries which had successful socialist revolutions to ultimately federate into socialist world republics. Deng's market reforms were seen by the imperialists as opening the door to overturning the social revolution of 1949. This has not occurred despite the creation of a powerful capitalist sector in the Chinese economy. The reforms have allowed the CCP to acquire modern technology by attracting foreign firms who routinely introduced sweatshop conditions known across the semi-colonial world. The CCP maintains control over the economy by means of the financial system that almost exclusively funds the state-owned sector, which still accounts for approximately 50% of China's GDP. These enterprises are far larger than those of the private sector and generally have comparably better working conditions. The Communist Party uses state-owned enterprises to maintain social stability by prioritizing large-scale employment and social benefits to appease workers rather than pursuing maximum profit. State-owned enterprises serve as the CCP's economic power base by enacting the 5-year plans which still determine the course of economic development. Since the reforms began in 1978, Beijing has lifted more than 800 million people out of absolute poverty. China remains a deformed worker state in which the state economy dominates and the law of value comes second, much to the imperialists' frustration. China's capitalist class has not yet been able to pose a credible threat to CCP rule and replicate the social counter-revolution that took place in the Soviet Union in 1991. China is stuck in its development between capitalism and genuine socialism. It can't move back to capitalism without a capitalist counter-revolution, or forward to genuine socialism without a political proletarian revolution in which CCP rule would be replaced by the direct rule of the working class led by revolutionaries who are committed to extending economic planning and international socialist revolution. Despite their lack of a consistently revolutionary program, the workers' autonomous federations, which emerged across the People's Republic during the Tiananmen Square uprising in 1989, with their commitment to the planned economy whilst wanting to abandon the bureaucratic mismanagement and privileges of the CCP bureaucracy, embody the type of workers' organizations that could revive the long-forgotten revolutionary roots that the CCP once had. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. Kevin?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for, it's really interesting to hear all of the speakers so far. And thanks for inviting me to, this opportunity to reflect on the Chinese Revolution. So in thinking about the Chinese Revolution, and I think all of the speakers highlighted that there's not one revolution, but several revolutions over the last 100 years, a little over 100 last year, at least since 1910 or 1911. And so it's fair, I think, to call the last century a century of revolution in China. And I think the meanings and legacy of those revolutions and what the Chinese Communist revolution experience means are still very much with us today and contested and sometimes debated. And those legacies very much still shape Chinese society today. I think concepts, ideas, references to what happened in the last 100 years still shape the political discourse and understanding in China today. One of the most obvious example is whenever people mention the Cultural Revolution in China, it's very much used as a warning against political chaos or mob violence, which is of course a very simplified view of what actually happened during the Cultural Revolution, which I also don't agree. But I think there are a lot of these legacies, what happened in the last 50 years, in the last 100 years, still shape how people think about China's, not only China's past, but also present and future. And I think, of course, opinions are still divided both within China and outside of China about the meaning and legacies of the Maoist era from 1949 to 76. Some people want to avoid a repeat of the Mao era at all costs, where others look back with nostalgia, and some people even go further and look for inspirations from the Maoist period, including some young people in China today. So in what follows, I would like to offer a few preliminary remarks and reflections of the last, if you will, the revolutions of the last 100 years. But I want to preface this by saying that I approach these issues not as expert of Chinese history, even though it's something I've studied and continue to read on. I very much offer these thoughts as someone who is grappling with these issues, with these legacies of Chinese revolutions and what they mean today as activists, as someone on the left. So maybe I should say a few sentences about myself and how I approach this. So I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s in China, in mainland China. And at the time, revolution was already felt a distant dream for my generation. And of course, after, there was a lot of discrediting of the revolutionary experience already by the 1980s. And by now, of course, a lot of the history has been very selectively erased. Of course, some are selectively revoked, but a lot of that revolutionary experience was selectively erased from popular memory or popular discourse, popular discussions. And of course, for me and many of my friends in our generation, when we were very, very young, our teenager years, revolution is something that we shied away from. It's something that we thought is too complicated and too difficult to grapple with. Then I got interested in labor rights issues, worker struggle in China, and I've spent the last decade or more studying, monitoring, discussing what worker struggles in China means for China and of course for the world. And a lot of this discussion sort of brought me back to thinking more about the Chinese revolutionary experiences. So here are just 4 brief points of my reflection. This is not very sophisticated. It's not sophisticated as the previous 3 speakers. So beg for forgiveness on that. So I think the first point I want to offer is I think the one legacy of the Chinese Revolution is that it really demonstrated in very dramatic terms the potentialities and possibilities of radical social transformation. Within a lifetime, just a couple of generations in China, China has gone through, as I mentioned, several social and political revolutions and social upheavals. The society of China today is definitely unrecognizable from the standpoint of someone looking at China in the early part of the 20th century. So my own grandparents who were born in the 1920s, they all passed away, but when they were alive, they were born in the 1920s, and within their lifetime, they saw the Japanese colonialism and occupation of parts of China in the 1930s. One of my mothers actually learned some Japanese in school in Beijing at the time. The civil war between the nationalists and communists in the 40s, of course, the Chinese Communist victory of 1949. And of course, they were participants of many of the political movements in the 1950s and 60s, campaigns in the 50s and 60s. And of course, they saw the market reform in the 80s and 90s. And much of the last century's revolutions and reform in China were inspired by this desire to build a radically different and better society. And as China has shown, radical transformations are possible. I think that this is a very simple point, obviously, but I think it's worth bearing in mind and repeating today, because I think we live in a sort of post-utopia society or world where it's hard to imagine the kind of radical social transformation and radically different societies that we have seen in China and also many other places over the last century, and that the possibilities of creating alternative societies to capitalism and imperialism. The second point I want to offer is that those social transformations don't happen by design or as planned. And of course, it's not a straightforward process. Again, this is something that the previous speakers highlighted in their own talks. Again, this is a simple idea, but I think it's important to recognize that the century of Chinese Revolution and social changes that happened is that extremely complicated and painful. There are a lot of positives and there are a lot of negatives. Any sort of simplistic view of either will be likely not give us a very solid understanding of that centuries of history. As people mentioned, the early Chinese communists in the 1920s, early 1920s and 30s, they really wanted to organize urban industrial workers. But really, what won the Chinese Communist Revolution was essentially rural strategy, including land reforms and mobilization of peasantry. And this is because I think, well, I don't want to go the reason, but basically, it's not always what you think is the best strategy on paper, but what's very concretely happening in China. And of course, after 1949, the real organization didn't end there. The real revolution or the real task only began. How do you organize the economy? How do you distribute resources? How do you organize work and production? What are the appropriate social and political organization for building a socialist or progressive society? All these questions are were by no means obvious. They don't have obvious answers. And there were a lot of mistakes and problems, structural issues that never got resolved. So those are hard problems. I think it's worth looking more into the Chinese experience to learn more how people deal with those questions, and a lot of lessons, both positive and negative. The third point is that workers' democracy matters. I think China had, during the Maoist period, China had what I would call state socialism, and I know other people may characterize it differently, and it's okay for me as long as we explain what we mean by those terms. But I think in that period, workers definitely in the Maoist period enjoyed a lot better social protection. The job security are much better. There are still problems, and they also had a much more power vis-a-vis management. But workers' democracy in any meaningful sense did not exist in the workplace in China during the Maoist period. There are some ostensibly workers' organizations, such as the Workers and Staff Congress at the workplace level. And sometimes those could be used as channels for workers to express their discontent. But overall, there was no democratic run or self-management by workers of those factories or the economy. I think it's not enough to just have state ownership. But what I think is really important is genuinely public ownership and workers' self-management of their workplace. I think that also go a long way toward countering the development of privileged or bureaucratic classes in the process of building socialist societies. The fourth and last point, I have 1 more minute, is really how to think about the fact, again, some speakers already mentioned that, how do you think about a Communist Party still in power? They not only brought about capitalism, but succeeded in making China the second largest economy, and may soon to be the largest economy, and one which that provide actually most of the global economic growth over the last decade. It's too tempting not to refer to the fact in recent years, there has been a somewhat revival debate about whether China is socialist or not, or at least maybe it's not capitalist, it's something else. If it's not socialist, at least it's not capitalist. Without going to the debate here, I think it's important to understand the history of the last few decades to really look at the Chinese transformation, the exploitation of labor, and the integration of China into the global system of capitalism. And if I just end with 2 sentences. I think I want to hear by saying, I think there's a lot to learn from the Chinese revolution experiences, both good and bad. I think compared to the Russian Revolution, there's very little attention to be that has been paid to the Chinese Revolution. In some ways, the Chinese revolutions are even more important because their legacies are directly impacting not only the lives of 1.5 billion people in China, but billions and more globally. Understanding their experiences in China, I think will prepare us on the left to navigate sometimes the very fraught terrain that we are on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We will now be moving into some speaker responses, and to the audience, you can begin formulating your questions and put them in the Q&A box. You'll also have the opportunity when we turn to raise your hand and pose your question vocally. So quick couple of things. Mike, just to kind of review, Mike, you were talking about the foregrounding the background in imperialism and state-led modernization, and emphasizing the party cut off from the class. Carl, you were talking about the pivot toward the peasantry and how this made the revolution possible, but also the ongoing bourgeois revolution with backward social forces and advanced social relations, as you posed it. Hans Peter was talking about was foregrounding the failure of the revolution in 1925 to 27, but also the priority of the collectivized economy today. And Kevin was posing also the issue of workers' democracy within and within the state-owned economy. So perhaps just to kind of, should we be thinking about here party and class, and the moment of how these 1920s moment and this post-Soviet moment, which seem to be both there. And please respond directly to each other. So Mike, you can go right ahead.
Did that well? Okay, thank you. Yes, I think that's a good summary, Clint. I started from the question, which other people have dealt with, which is, is Chinese communism an imitation of Stalinism? Right? Is that how we describe the problem? That they were Stalinist and they've got more flexible later, but they're really just copycats, right? Or maybe they've copied the best aspects of Stalinism. And I think that the Chinese Communist Party started from Chinese reform ideas about building a strong national state, right? That was the proviso. That was, so it wasn't, they weren't borrowing from foreigners or even Marxists, but going with the idea of a strong state, which of course happened in other Asian countries as well, and also lately. So when I talk about state-led modernization, I'm talking about state direction, not socialism. You can have state direction in both Koreas, North Korea and South Korea. You can have it in Japan. Japan had it. State direction and moderation of some kind. It doesn't abolish capitalism, but it is more advanced than the idea of classical capitalism. Now, I see China as a drawing on that legacy, the legacy that already began with Japan and Germany, of course, it mixed it with Marxism, right? And also with the Marxism that Mao produced, which is basing the party on the peasantry. Because as we say, there was a lack of a large working class, and a lot of them have been eliminated politically anyway. So the Communist Party moved into the countryside. So the thing is, I think, yes, they borrowed some things from Stalinism, but their main interest was to build a strong national state. And you can see that on all kinds of occasions, like in 1971, where although they had a lot to say about national liberation struggles, they supported Pakistan when Bangladesh began to initiate a national liberation struggle, because it was in the Chinese state's interest to support Pakistan against a national liberation struggle. And in fact, the Communist Party of India, which was allied with the Maoists in China, failed, sort of had a great problem with that. And they just ebbed away. They were destroyed as a party because China, in its own interest, its own state interest, supported Pakistan, the Pakistan state. So Deng saw that in order to continue building a strong state, they needed to introduce certain capitalist reforms, right? Now, that brings its own problems, right? Why capitalist reforms without democracy? And of course, we know there's a response to that in the last 20 years or whatever. But the Chinese Communist Party drew on the legacy from those reformers and others who wanted to build a strong Chinese state. And that's consistent and it's continuous throughout the life of the Chinese state.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Paul?
I'd like to make 2 points. One is about the Chinese Communist Party. The idea that it is somehow detached and living way up in the sky somewhere apart from the Chinese people is wrong. The Chinese Communist Party is, humongous. Nearly 90 million cadres, people. 1 out of every 12 or 15 people in China are members of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party exists everywhere. In every institution, every factory, every church, every art museum, every daycare center, there is a cell of the Chinese Communist Party, including in the capitalist firms. Sometimes they're open, sometimes they're semi-open, and sometimes they're secret. But there's not a single institution in China that doesn't have a cell of the Chinese Communist Party. And they are from top to bottom, and so they're intimately connected with the people. Now you can say, well, maybe they ignore everything people have to say. That could be, and undoubtedly in some cases it's true, because we know some of the leadership stuff would get purged and thrown out, corruption and all sorts of things. I visited Mondragon one time in Spain, and they had a saying when you first got there: "This is not paradise, and we are not angels." Well, you can say the same thing about China. This is not paradise, and it's not run by angels, but it is run by the Chinese Communist Party. And don't you ever forget it. That's one of the with Chinese characteristics. It's written into the Constitution. The second point I'd like to make is on the question of peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence started with Lenin. He was the one who first put it out. He understood very well that eventually, to build socialism, you're going to have to replace capitalism. That he figured that was a law of Marxism, a law of history. But it wasn't a law of history that you had to fight all capitalists at once. And so that's why he put out, started the policy of peaceful coexistence to make arrangements with some capitalist governments as opposed to others. And it continually developed in various forms over the years, up until the Bandung Conference, when it was written as a principle into the findings of that conference by Nehru and Zhou and I, and then finally into the UN Charter. There's one country in the world that finds it extremely difficult to observe the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and that's the United States, my country. And so I think it's a very good organizing principle for a peace movement, to make use of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and try to hold our government to them. And I likewise think it's a good idea generally. I've been disabused of the idea that we are going to have world revolution by having the Red Armies march into other countries. I don't think it's going to happen that way. And I think history has shown that whenever somebody does try to happen, it doesn't turn out well. The countries, the social revolution in each country is going to be the work of the peoples in that country themselves. They can learn things from other countries and get some solidarity and support and so on and so forth. But it's really up to us. And we're not going to have the Red Army march around the world and break us off. I think that's a Neoplatonist delusion.
Thank you, Carl. Hans-Peter?
Yeah, maybe I pick up with the last point that Carl made. I don't think anyone is suggesting Red Armies marching to countries or occupying capitalist countries and forcing the population to turn communist. What I was referring to when talking about world revolution was the idea behind the early Comintern, i.e. building a world party of communist parties, all dedicated to socialist revolution, obviously all within the framework and operating in the current circumstances of their given countries. And so rather than having a very clear directed framework enforced on them where they have to all do one thing in the same way at the same time, they'd rather obviously adopt what is necessary in a given situation in their own countries, but cooperating. And it has very practical reasons, this kind of revolutionary internationalism. And I think the failure, and I think it's incorrect to say that Chinese communism is entirely separate from the Soviet experience. One might ask why the Chinese Communist Party even called itself Communist Party if they didn't take into account what the Soviet Union did. The Xi Jinping himself uses the term opposition to historical nihilism, which clearly builds positively on what he sees as Lenin's and Stalin's and Mao's experience. So there's quite clearly that link in that history that we can't ignore. But internationalism is relevant because you can't, if you want to build a communist society in the Marxist meaning, which is not necessarily limited or can't be limited to a nation state. You need raw materials from all across the world, as the Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to do that within the broader framework of the world market. To get those, you need expertise and technology that has been developed in other countries. And yes, you can, that is currently being done by means that Carl hinted at, which is trade with capitalist countries. And yes, Lenin obviously was in favor of that in the absence of successful revolutions in those capitalist countries, but he also, acknowledging that didn't mean to him that you therefore drop building the communist parties in those countries. And I think the framework of the new economic policy within the early Soviet Union is a useful blueprint, obviously on a far larger scale and in different historic circumstances right now, to understand the way that the Chinese economy works. As in, we still have state control at the center. The Chinese Communist Party determines who is allowed to invest in what areas and economic sectors in the country. and yeah, wants to utilize capitalist sort of the hyper exploitation but also the productivity growth that comes with capitalist development, which they weren't able to enforce in the state-owned economy to the same levels. And so they're toying around a bit with trying to use a bit more work discipline even in the state-owned enterprises, but at the same time, they need to hold on to these state-owned enterprises because they are the economic power base of large parts of the CCP bureaucracy. And if they give up that whole sector, and that's what our financial pundits all across the world were hoping that would gradually happen after the introduction of Deng's reforms, then ultimately that state-owned sector would be so eroded, and there would be a Communist Party faction similar to that of Boris Yeltsin in the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 1990s, who then say, you know what, we just privatize all these state-owned enterprises, take it in our own hands. Obviously, that's on a tiny scale happening in China, and there's probably 10 years ago there was more of a there's been a backlash against that, where the broader population said this is corruption and so on, and then she starts this big anti-corruption campaign and tries to rein in the most obvious excesses of CCP bureaucrats enriching themselves at the expense of the state and so on.
Thank you, Hans-Peter.
Yeah, I'll leave it there.
We can bring it up more in discussion. And Kevin?
Okay, great. I actually don't find anything particularly I disagree with. I think I would just elaborate on maybe one point about the, for lack of a better word, flexibility of the CCP over the last 100 years, since we're talking about 100 years of their funding. Definitely that the party changed from not just in the last 30, 40 years. It changed from 1920s to the 30s and 40s. Again, as some of our speakers have already highlighted, the Communist Party of the early 1920s was very different from the Communist Party of the 30s and 40s. And again, post 1949, the Communist Party was again not the same. In many ways, maybe we can get into in discussion. And of course, the Communist Party of today is radically different from that of the 1960s and 70s. As probably almost all of us, or maybe all of us know, it absorbed a lot of millionaires and billionaires into the party, while also disciplining other private capitalists. I think it's by that very flexible adaptation that the CCP has managed to survive for this long. Of course, this is not a defense of CCP. I'm just making the observation that I think the CCP today and what it means to be a Chinese communist and what Chinese communism means is unrecognizable from 50 years ago or let alone 100 years ago. And I think, there's one way looking at the CCP and state. I think the other thing that for me is very important and central is looking at class. And for me, it's looking at the working class. The working class has changed also dramatically over the last 100 years. Again, the working class in the 1920s is different from the state, mostly state working class or state sector working class with the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And today, the state workers in SOE, in state-owned enterprises, are not the same as the state workers of the 70s and 80s. This is something I did my research on before by visiting state-owned factories that have been, so there are privatized state-owned factories that are already become private enterprises, but there are also restructured state-owned enterprises, which are including some of the largest corporations actually today, right? There are state-owned banks, state-owned petroleums, corporations, etc. And the workers in those state-owned enterprises are definitely not the same old Maoist state workers. They are also mostly migrant workers of one sort or another. They may be better educated than those in the export sector, but they are, they work on contracts, short-term 2 or 3 year contract. A lot of them are so-called dispatch labor, basically very highly casualized form of labor. So I think just to conclude, I think there are several things we need to be looking at, right? There are the ideology, there are the party or state form, but also there are transformation of class and class relations, and who are the working classes in the past and today. And of course, the most fundamental question, I guess, for all of us is, what is the potentialities for progressive transformation of Chinese societies by Chinese workers?
Thank you so much, Kevin. We've got 2 hands raised. So first we'll go to Ephraim.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So my question is for Kevin, and it kind of picks up on this point you were just making about the flexibility of the Chinese Communist Party. Because listening to the description you gave of the transformation of Chinese society in the past 100 years, and also the different phases, including what you described as a period in the 50s and 60s, when workers would have had a better deal vis-a-vis management and their welfare kind of guaranteed by the state, but without worker democracy, as well as the changes to market reforms in the late 70s through 90s, and the kind of casualization of and the kind of precarious situation of workers' contracts in the 2000s up until the present. Sounds very familiar, sounds very similar to how leftists would describe the history of, say, Britain, where I am, in the past 100 years. And so I guess my question is, there's a question of whether the flexibility of the CCP is leading world capitalism towards socialism, or just following the trends of world capitalism. That we have this phrase of socialism with Chinese characteristics, but a lot of what you described seems kind of very global in its recognizability. So my first question is just to you about how do you understand these transformations in China and the Chinese Communist Party in relation to world capitalism, right? And changes that have happened in other places, predominantly the kind of centers of capitalism in Western Europe and North America. And I guess the second part of that is that then what appears to distinguish China is this question of revolution. So you said that China has had it's been the century of revolution for China the past 100+ years. And I guess the question, and obviously we're talking about the party, and the party needs to be considered not as an end in itself, but as a tool for revolution. And so the question then becomes, what is revolution? How are we actually classifying revolution versus just, say, regime change? Because also the changes that happened in Britain, for example, could and are sometimes referred to as revolutions. The revolution of the welfare state in 1945 and the revolution of Thatcherism in the 80s. So they just seem to be revolutions, but without a kind of similar kind of role of a party or state seizure or violence even. So how, I'm not endorsing those characterizations, but how do you and perhaps the other panelists characterize revolution, and how do you understand the relationship between the party and revolution? Thanks.
Clint, should I respond or should I wait?
Yes, please go right ahead, Kevin.
And how much time should I?
We'll just respond as you see fit.
Okay.
And
yes, stop me if you think I go on for too long. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think 2 parts. I will try to be very brief. I think you're right. I think the experience of, if you will, Chinese capitalism tracks very closely with global trends, and not surprisingly, because of at least since the 80s, China gradually over time integrated itself into global capitalism, more so in the 1990s and early 2000s, when China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. But certainly since the 80s, China economic development. And there are some historical coincidence there, but I do think there's to a large degree a correspondence or parallel, if you will, connected development both in China and the wider global capitalism, to the extent that China, the height of privatization in China is the 1990s, and the basic defeat of state working class. It was a very violent defeat of the state sector working class when the Chinese state tried to privatize SOEs, and probably 30 to 40 million workers lost their job within the span of a few years. So there was a lot of resistance and violent repression against state sector workers. And then that allowed, in many ways, the introduction of much more casualized and precarious labor in the 2000s. And that trend even intensified, accelerated in the 2010s. Of course, the other side of that is also the rural migrant working class also organized themselves autonomously, autonomous from the state or independent of the state, and for about 10 years fought very directly with capital, with the employers at the factory level, which we can also talk about if people are interested. To the second part of the question very quickly, I think, what revolution, I will leave that question maybe to other speakers, because I don't think I can define that within just a couple of minutes or even more than that. But I think what's interesting now is, people, sorry to bring this up to date too much, is, the talk of common prosperity in China. And I've seen articles both from the left and right and anywhere in the middle, anywhere in between, in the middle, talking about this is Chinese going socialism or going back to socialism or whatever. Some people would say this is always socialism, right? So, but for me, those specific measures, if you look at closely, are very programmatic responses to capitalist crisis that have been accumulating in the last 10, 15 years. Again, we can go into details if we want. I don't want to take up too much time here, but they are now a program towards socialism, but they're trying to address specific crisis within capitalism. And I think there is, Xi Jinping just published maybe 2 weeks ago, a speech he gave maybe back in August, but only published in the last couple of weeks in the party journal, Qiu Shi, is a theoretical Communist Party journal, in which he tried to explain what common prosperity means. It basically boils down to some social welfare, but not too much, because if there's too much social welfare, it will breed lazy people, and we don't want to lazy people. We want more equal distribution, maybe, but that should not be at the expense or at the cost of being lazy or being not productive. So this is very much a very moderate reformist a major. It's by no means socialist or revolutionary. I would end it there.
Mike and Carl.
Yes, I think that's a very good question. What is a revolution? What is radical transformation? I mean, in fact, what Kevin just described there could be described as what happened in the 1940s in Britain. Some social welfare, going after prosperity. So that must have been a kind of revolution. Also, in the 1930s in Russia, what Stalin was doing, that was a revolution, wasn't it? Because it involved change of the economy. It included state direction. So it was like socialism is the state direction. So, was that a revolution? The law of value, classical capitalism, had disappeared. So we have to refer to the Stalinist revolution. Interesting thing, when the Bolsheviks started, what they wanted was world revolution. That was the aim. Right? I can't see when the Chinese Communist Party was ever committed seriously to world revolution. I mean, I mentioned the example of Pakistan, supporting Pakistan in the 1971. It's always that China always had national interests, which the CCP was backing up. And of course, it's not interested in that. It's interested in that now. The reason why it's in Africa and other places is to build up for a Chinese state national interest. And although that has involved statism, transformation of the economy, yes, and the disappearance of the law of value, that is a revolution like Stalin's revolution, right? And as Marxists, we have to distinguish between the workers' revolution we want and what these other revolutions, these part-way revolutions, have corrupted our sense of what a revolution is.
Carl?
One thing I'd like to encourage people to do, borrowing from Dong, is to emancipate our minds. If you took all the writings of Marx and Engels and put them on a bookshelf, it would be about 14 feet long. The last 6 inches of that would be their ideas on what a future socialist society might be. There's lots of things that once you've taken power, that it will do you absolutely no good to go back to the classics. After Lenin's death and Stalin coming to power and he shut down the NEP, he had to faced the task of feeding the workers and bringing about revolution in the countryside. He had no classic to guide him, really. He had to make it up. And that's what he did. He made it up. He made it up as he went along. The liquidation of the kulaks class, and, the Sovietization of industrial, in some ways, the Soviet Russian agriculture never recovered from it since. He made it up. He made up all kinds of shit. And, they can declare the law of value gone all they want, but it wasn't. They can say that there were no markets in the Soviet Union or any other socialist country, but every socialist country has markets in, whether they're called black markets or tiered markets. The markets preceded capitalism and will go beyond capitalism. That was Deng Xiaoping's insight. So I think we have to emancipate our minds and try to study China today in its own terms. They are sinifying Marxism and they are developing a new Marxism based on their conditions. And they have the vast majority of, even if you say 10% of the Chinese Communist Party are serious Marxists, you've got some 8 million Marxists there working away at applying Marxism to their own country, more than all the rest of the Marxists in the world combined. And my view is that they have something to say about it. And we would do well to try to listen to them and try to learn something new that's going on under the sun. I think that, I think China is exactly what they say they are. They're a socialist market economy at the very beginning levels of socialism and very far away from a communist society where the state withers away, the market withers away due to fully automated, cybernated production that reduces the working class towards zero and reduces the cost of human labor in any given commodity towards zero. That's where communist society can begin to emerge. Anything that calls itself communist before then is fooling himself. It's just socialism is the transition from the class society to the class society, and it's going to take a long time. And in that period, there's going to be class struggle. There's going to be there's going to be a bourgeoisie, there's going to be a proletariat, and other classes in between. And what's playing out in China is one of the more protracted and more interesting aspects of whatever has happened in the world. So the Chinese Communist Party leadership, Politburo, I think, goes to bed every night worried about how do we do things so that we don't end up like the Soviet Union did. Because they saw that as something that they want to avoid at all costs. So I think that's the big problem they worry about. And I think that, worker democracy and all these things, these are all very good aspirations. They do have elections in China. I had a friend I worked with in Chicago who was a Red Guard in his youth, and he told me about, its upsides and downsides of being a Red Guard. And he went back to China to visit his family every year. And finally, one year, he said, this is the first time where he wanted to stay. Whereas it was the first time they had elections on the village level where somebody could lose. And so that's pretty much the norm now. There are elections on every level. But unlike our country, whose democracy, and I wouldn't wish on anyone, they're very hierarchical. There are about 6 layers. Nobody gets to vote for the people on the top except the layer immediately below it. But it's not like there's no democracy at all, and people don't have anything to say. The workers may be passive or skeptical about it. I'm sure I know workers, and the workers I know, take everything with a grain of salt, and they will wildcat at the drop of a hat if they think they can win something. And I think the Chinese workers in that sense are probably no different.
Thank you, Carl. Hans-Peter, did you want to respond?
Sure. Well, according to Marx, a social revolution, and I think that's the one that we are interested in talking about here, is one where a social class overthrows the state power of the current ruling class, which again is based on a specific mode of production, in order to introduce a new mode of production. And I think that's the introduction of a new mode of production clearly occurred in China in 1949. The distortion there is that the movement that brought about this new mode of production, which is fundamentally proletarian, was brought in by a movement that was sociologically based on the peasantry. But there was a very clear situation in China. They overthrew the Kuomintang. They were the Chinese capitalists fundamentally at that stage. And they had options. The democracy of the 4 classes potentially tried to suggest that, collaboration and cooperation with capitalists and the proletariat and the peasantry and so on could be something very specific and Chinese perhaps. But ultimately, very quickly, they fell in line with the Stalin Soviet Union, which was, unlike capitalism, was a bureaucratically planned economy, and so that was introduced, and that obviously swept into power the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a direct relation between the Chinese Communist Party and the specific mode of production we have in China today. Obviously, just like and I do think that Chinese, and I call it Stalinism because I think structurally it's similar. Obviously, they have their own ways of expressing certain ideas, but fundamentally, the idea of peaceful coexistence, of socialism in one country, which they call, the fight for rejuvenating the Chinese nation and so on and so forth, the idea behind it is just the same as Stalin's formulation of socialism in one country in 1924. So that raises the question of, okay, where are they now? Because and I disagree with Carl. I think that obviously you need to understand the classics and Das Kapital and so on in order to understand the law of value, because that is fundamentally what describes the structure of capitalism. If you don't do that, then you haven't got any idea of what comes after. And the idea of Marx very cautiously outlined, and he hasn't got a full book or multiple books on the economic system after the revolution, and I don't think he wasn't a utopian. He just said, these are the broad strokes that we need to introduce, which is the collectivization of the economy by freely associated producers. Under Stalin, the producers weren't necessarily so freely associated anymore, but they were associated by the Communist Party and by the will of the Communist Party. So what we have in China today is experimentation, just like in the early Soviet Union, with market measures to a limited extent, with an awareness, because otherwise they wouldn't have the CCP wouldn't have to worry about 1991 and Gorbachev and so on, which she openly does, that there can be a capitalist counter-revolution, i.e. the generalization of the law of value in Chinese society. And they don't want that because that would fragment and destroy the Communist Party rule. And so they're veering and trying to balance capitalist measures and state collectivized measures without really democratically involving the working class. To an extent, they sometimes do it. They sometimes do it in a limited way by the state-controlled trade unions, where they say, "Okay, things are going a bit too far here. You need to introduce higher wages and so on and so forth." But by and large, the role of the ACFTU, the state-controlled trade union federation, is one of ensuring that production carries on and is not in defense of the working class. So, to use another Marxist term, that the Chinese Communist Party plays a Bonapartist role in the state in trying to balance, to maintain its own control over the economy by balancing working class interests against capitalist interests, whilst wanting to prevent that capitalist interests win out to the full extent. And I think that's why I said earlier in my presentation, they're stuck somewhere between the problem of potentially falling back entirely to capitalism via capitalist counter-revolution, but they also have no means of fully democratizing society, because that would mean that the Communist Party would have to cede economic control to broader organs of working class control that we had in the early Soviet Union and that were subsequently abandoned.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. I think we still have the question in view of what it means to overcome capitalism. But we've got 3 hands raised. So if you could just keep the questions as short as possible so that we can have the panelists respond in full. We'll go to Carl Berg. Carl? If you're talking, Carl, we can't hear you. Do you perhaps want to pose your question in the chat or in the Q&A box? All right. And then Kevin, who is doing the tech, you were next on the list.
Yep. So first of all, thanks to all the speakers. It's been a very informative and lively discussion so far. I wanted to pick up upon a point Mike Belbin raised and maybe follow up on it into a question to pose to the other 3 speakers, and then maybe hear from Mike after the 3 of them have responded, which is that, classically conceived Marxism's agenda was, world socialist revolution led by the advanced metropolitan countries, right? And so if Maoism is a species of Stalinism, and if Stalinism is the accommodation of Marxism to defeat by abdicating the task of the world socialist revolution and turning Marxism into an affirmative ideology, then how is Maoism and also the CCP an obstruction to reconstituting or constituting, as the case may be, the mass socialist party in the West, right? The advanced metropole, the United States. And so that's the question. That brings to mind the 1956 moment, right? Many people in the New Left saw the Sino-Soviet split as possibly opening up the possibility of constituting the mass socialist party in the West by the new left's moment, but this came to pass and did not happen. And so I want to also figure the question I have with the 56 moment in mind. How did Maoism and also the CCP in that moment go from being potentially an opportunity to constituting this party in the West? How to go from that to becoming an obstruction? And also, I'm also asking a question in the present. How is in the present the CCP and Maoism an obstruction to constituting a socialist party in the West? Thank you.
Yep, go ahead, Carl.
I took a class in Beijing on the question of the Comintern, and I took it twice. Once when the gang was in charge, and another afterwards. And it was very interesting. You know, I learned about the 10 two-line deviation, 10 two-line struggles and various deviations. I won't go through them. The committee of the returned Bolsheviks and all this and that. But when all is said and done, I asked them a question. I said, well, what do you think? Should we have a new Comintern? How do you sum up the old? And they said, well, we haven't summed it all up all that well yet. You know, in some ways we have to study it some more. But they said they think it had a fatal flaw, which is that no matter how much you tried to avoid it, there was a big brother party. And that big brother party would have undue influence in all the little brother parties and would divert them from what they needed to do most, which was to try to unite Marxism with the conditions in their own country and to develop an American Marxism, a British Marxism, a French Marxism, or so on, that understood the conditions in their own country as number one, and not to see some international line, you know, set up, you know, passed by some international meeting in Moscow as to what their strategy and tactics should be. So I think that I agree with that. I think the idea of having Comintern is ridiculous. We can have conferences like World Social Forums and things like that, where we can share experience and learn a great deal from each other and so on. But when all is said and done, if you want to make revolution, you've got to deal with the forces at hand in your own country. Nobody else is going to do it for you.
Mike, did you want to respond? Because he was going off of your presentation.
Great. Okay. I think Hans Peter has advanced this a bit because he's, you know, focusing on the obstruction, which is not the obstruction of the Communist Party in particular in China, but the obstruction of by the idea, Platonic or not, that the disappearance of the law of value, state direction, is what is sufficient for the world socialist revolution. And of course, the whole 20th century proves that it was not. You can have a post-capitalist society, which you did have in China and Russia, right? Which was both were afraid of workers' democracy. And like the early Bolshevism, you need a commitment on any party anywhere, not as armies invading other people, but as parties linking up with each other that favor internationalism and workers' democracy. I mean, as Hans Peter said, the Chinese Communist Party is not committed to workers' democracy. It's committed to a few elections here, but not of the major leaders, of course, and the dominance of the party. Yes, in a society which, I mean, I would agree was mainly statist, you know, it has areas of capitalism. And as he said, there's this balancing act We can have areas of capitalism, but not democracy, which is the way that the West hypocritically presents itself. And, these ideas, but I think the West itself is unstable too, because of the hypocrisy that is so blatant, that we are democratic and people have power because they elect people every 4 years. Yes, but there is another instability through anti-elitism in China as well. And I think we should link up, with a general commitment, which is not, I see all these conditions as more or less the same. A commitment towards internationalism and workers' democracy, workers' power. That's basic. Whether you're Marx, Lenin, or us right now. Thank you.
Hans Peter or Kevin, did either of you want to respond? Perhaps just briefly to reframe the question. We got the issue on the table where the legacy of the Chinese Revolution could have been revolution in the 1920s in Britain and China at the same time. But it appears that the legacy of the revolution is Western Maoism and the Chinese state and this collectivized economy. So how does that pose the question of how the left should be thinking about the revolution today?
I'm happy to respond to that. Well, I think the existence of the Chinese deformed worker state with the social gains that are undoubtedly there is actually a positive for the international working class. The capitalist counter-revolution in the Soviet Union was a massive blow to the global left. And obviously for the working class in Russia, living conditions fell through the floor. I think it was the largest economic devastation to living standards without the event of a war in human history. So if the same happens in China, I think we will probably be felt more acutely in East Asia, but that's one element. In terms of revolution, I think, and that's where the 1927 and so on lessons come in, is one of the class collaborationist ideas behind Maoism. And effectively, well, at this point, and Deng said that very explicitly in speaking to the leaders of other countries and so on, in saying, "Oh, don't copy our model." If he was really proud, or if evidently the Chinese economy is doing so much better than so many other semi-colonial economies, there should be a desire to say, this is how you do it. But the problem there is that in order to achieve what China has achieved in terms of poverty alleviation, it requires a social revolution. And I think that takes us back to an element that Kevin mentioned earlier, the reception in broader Chinese society of the Cultural Revolution as an idea of chaos, instability, and possibly threatening Communist Party rule in China itself, whereby any workers' uprisings that would bring about worker states elsewhere in the world would potentially, if they manage to do that with on the basis of sort of workers' council structures and so on, and would pose a problem for the Chinese Communist Party, because they are the guys who say, we know best how to steer the economy and so on, and you workers just have to fall in line, and that model would be threatened by such events. So it poses a problem in that thing. Just a brief correction: the idea of world revolution is not that, at the click of a finger, all the advanced countries and the backward countries have to make the revolution all at the same minute. It's more the idea of having the idea that if we have successful socialist revolutions in advanced countries, or that these are necessary in order long term, in order for successful socialist revolutions survive in a poorer semi-colonial world, by means of technology transfer, by means of and so on and so forth, to build a material basis so that the societies in the semi-colonial world with successful socialist revolutions create enough for everybody, and we don't have the emergence of a party apparatus that controls distribution and appropriates more than the fair share to themselves and their own well-being, which I think is what we see in China today.
If I can add to that, I think I would, in both thinking about the Chinese experience and revolutionary experience, and thinking about conceptualizing what revolution is or is going to look like, I would still put, as others have said, workers at the center of it. If there were only a few million workers 100 years ago in China, industrial workers, there are now several hundreds of millions of workers in China. Just only a few years ago, the Chinese urban population surpassed China's rural population. So there are more people living in the cities than in the countryside. And the vast majority of them obviously are workers of different sorts, right? Factory, service, et cetera, public sector. And that's powerful. There are, of course, a lot of constraints. There are a lot of state repression. There's still a lot of self-organizing that should be happening among workers. But I would still put workers and their potential to organize against both state and capital at the core of envisioning what revolution looks like. So I start with what's happening on the ground. I try to think about, okay, how do we conceptualize workers' power in China? And I think that the same goes with analyzing any other countries in terms of any potential for radical social change, right? You start with where we are in terms of where working class are, both again, the potentials and the limitations. And then you sort of think, okay, this is where people are. What are the next steps that would further empower workers, or that would take workers to gain more political or economic or social power? That's where I would start, and that's where I would look at when I think about revolution.
Thanks, Kevin. We'll take 2 questions from the chat, and then we've got 2 more hands, so I think we'll be able to wrap up in time. So Tom asks, what significance for the possibilities of post-capitalism in China do speakers ascribe to the internal migrant system? And then a bit more generally, how do the speakers think the lack of workers' councils as the form of social governance impacts on the possibility of China moving towards socialism? So in terms of those labor relations on the ground. Does anybody have? Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, I was waiting for you to call on people. I think that this question of post-capitalism or sort of internal migration system, and I think that second question is about, can you remind me of the second question?
The lack of workers' councils.
The worker councils. So I think China is somewhat maybe unique, because I don't want to say unique or exceptional, as if China is somewhat so different from other capitalist formations. But it's interesting to observe that in China, China has just been through about a decade and a half, 2 decades of very militant worker struggles on the ground, several thousand strikes a year by migrant workers and also other rural migrant workers, and also other kind of worker from roughly the mid-2000s, early 2000s to mid-2000s up into about 2015, 16, when they sort of declines for many reasons, state repression, also the changing structure of the Chinese economy. It began to like in a significant way deindustrialize. So there were almost 2 decades of very militant worker struggle, but there was not allowed, you may argue, or did not develop kind of workers' organization of its own in the form of either trade unions or mass labor, political labor parties, or workers' council, etc. There's a state obviously controlled All China Federation of Trade Unions, but of course, as with pretty much all state-controlled trade unions, that they would come in sometimes when there's a strike to mediate, but their goal is really to resolve the strike more than to represent or struggle for workers. The result of this, to summarize, is that Chinese workers have been very militant, very direct. So that's why you see so many wildcat strikes over the last 20 years. But it did not consolidate into, if I will, the broader or bigger social political power, because there's no vehicle, there's no mass organization that translate that thousands of strikes a year into more structured, organized social political power. So there are both potentialities. Again, I want to emphasize, even today, even though the news coverage on strikes and worker struggle have gone down in China, again, for many different reasons, there are still a lot of strikes going on. But at the same time, there's limits which we are seeing, which is that those 1,000 strikes have not translated into a sufficient independent power that challenge, capital or capitalism in China. But again, I would still put my hope in the self-organizing potential of workers of different kinds. Yeah, I'll pause it there.
Carl? Or you go ahead, Mike, and then Carl.
I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, but I mean, I like, but what I think of both Kevin's and Hans Peter's characterization of the present period. Yes, there's instability. Yes, there's a drive amongst many people to more democracy. Kevin's point about the strikes, but not yet consolidated. So we have to have a drive to supporting workers' democracy and international revolution, which doesn't mean everybody does the same thing at the same time, but you can be committed to the same end. You can have that idea there. And I think the trouble is, the Communist Party of China, is not going to be the medium for those values, as they are afraid of workers' democracy. They are not interested in internationalism. They are a nationalist state project. So we have to reject the party first, and any idea that they are aspiring to something that we want. And how then do we base ourselves on the unstable working class elements? And of course, a lot of working class elements are drifting in all kinds of political directions, and that can be depressing. But, that's what we get to. The same old ideas of workers' democracy and international revolution. Okay.
Carl?
Recall what I said earlier. Every Chinese factory has a cell with a party in it, including those where there are workers who go on wildcat strikes. It's not like the party's absent. The party's right there next to it. Likewise with the union. Sometimes the party will support the wildcat strike. Many times they will. Sometimes the workers will win. Other times they will lose, back and forth. You win a few, you lose some. And workers will continue to struggle. So I don't expect that to change. China is too large and too diverse to have that kind of control. It's better to have people rise up and protest and correct things. But there is a third rail, and this is what has to be kept in mind. The third rail is this is written into the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, that the The country is ruled by the Communist Party of China. That's the ruling party. And if you organize to replace or overthrow it, you're outside the law. You can fight for better wages or working conditions or against high conditions, or you can even try to overthrow this or that bureaucrat. But you can't move to organize to overthrow the party. Now, the interesting thing to me is that it's largely unknown here in the West, is that the Chinese Communist Party is far from monolithic. I mean, if I was there, I'd probably join it and join. It has 6 or 7 major contending schools of thought within it, some of which are quite in tune with my own thinking. If you go to that link I put in the chat and sort on China and scroll down a bit, you'll find an article written by a Chinese Marxist and a member of the Chinese Communist Party on these 6 or 7 major contending schools of thought within the party itself. So there's debate and discussion within it. It's not a monolith. Right now, Xi's grouping is the one that's ruling, and it rules with a pretty much of an iron hand. But things change in China. And Xi's not going to live forever. Something, or someone is going to replace him. And it's good for us to try to, study what's going on there. There's new things going on there. And things that don't fit into our Neoplatonist concepts of what workers' democracy ought to look like. God forbid it looks like what it is in our country, where we only have 6% of the working class allowed to have unions, of any sort. God forbid that they have an electoral college in the Senate. I mean, in a way, you can see the Chinese Communist Party is sort of their Senate, and the Chinese People Congress is to say it's sort of our House of Representatives. It's a higher body that's more stable and tampers things down. But that's a piss poor analogy, really. The best thing to do is to look at China in its own terms and try to understand what's going on, and look at it. They are a civilizational state and party. That's a very important concept to understand.
Did you want to respond, Hans-Peter?
Sure. Yeah, I think maybe I start with Lenin on the NEP, in which he said that trade unions, unlike in China today, Kostang outlawed the right to strike in 1983, I think it was. Said that trade unions have the right to strike against bureaucratization, elements of bureaucratization in the state apparatus in the early Soviet Union, and against where capitalist firms within the framework of the new economic policy sort of super exploit and overstep the line and so on. And I think that's pretty much the line that I would take. There can be reactionary worker strikes. I think the movement of Solidarność in Poland in 1981 was a genuine workers' movement to an extent, but with a clear capitalist counter-revolutionary program. They wanted to reintroduce market measures to and abandon the planned economy. And if such a formation emerged in China, I'd be opposed to it, and I think we all should be. But on the other hand, I think similar state to, or another deformed worker state where we've seen the type of revolutions that I think are required in China today as well, was Hungary in 1956, where you had a workers' uprising that clearly committed to the planned economy, but said the Stalinist bureaucracy had to be overthrown, and they did form workers' councils and so on as governmental structures. They still had some illusions in some reform Stalinists in the government as well, which I think the Tiananmen Square, the workers' contingents had as well. But that's the kind of thing, that we should aspire to, in my view, or that Chinese workers should be aspiring to. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
All right, and now we'll take a question from Zayu.
Thanks, Clint. I wanted to pick up on a point Hans-Peter made earlier, which is that the current condition of China being beneficial to the international left, and sort of drawing an analogy to the revolutionary defeatism in the Second International. But I think there is a crucial difference between the Second International and the present, which is that there was an international, and as such, the genuine possibility of a socialist revolution, a global socialist revolution. And relatedly, I think Carl earlier brought up the issue of political leadership, right? Drawing the comparison between Chinese unions and the unions in the US. So I wanted to just pose a very general question to all the panelists, that in what ways how do you think the current condition in China as a opportunity or obstacle to the formation of an international left? And relatedly, is the Chinese question to be solved in China or elsewhere?
Thank you, Kevin. And since we're at the end of our time, we can kind of use this to sort of, yeah. All right, Carl.
I would say that the main way China helps us today is that they're in the midst of changing the world order from one dominated by US hegemonism and other hegemonisms into a multipolar world. That's number one. A multipolar world where no one really has hegemony. And China has been a powerful force through a number of its projects and institutions in doing that. They've also given some consistent assistance to a number of the existing socialist countries. Yesterday it was just announced that Cuba had joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is at a time when the U.S. is cracking down on its embargo on Cuba. So China's coming to its assistance. It's done the same with Venezuela and a number of other countries around the world. It's formed agreements and trade agreements and so on, which are mutually beneficial to both sides. And you could say that, well, China's making money on these things. It only is 1 or 2% of their whole GDP. But in any case, there are a radical difference between the agreements China forms with other countries than what the classical European or US colonialists or semi-colonialists formed. So China's giving an alternative to the World Bank and IMF and all of that. And that is opening up all kinds of possibilities for advancement of progressive forces. We've seen some of it here in right next to us in Mexico, with the advance of AMLO as to the presidency and the Progressive Party. And then it's establishing new and more creative relationships with Cuba at the same time. So by reorienting the entire world order and operating within the principles of the UN Charter and the 5 principles of coexistence, peaceful coexistence, China is doing us all a big favor.
Hans-Peter?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think there's one point maybe that I want to point to, which is that a lot of the Western left believed prior to 1991 that if only the Soviet Union collapsed and so on, the working class would flock, because Stalinism had tainted the workers' movement so badly, that if the Soviet Union collapsed, that would open a new road and there would be a blank page, and suddenly everyone would be rushing to revolutionary conclusions in the West. And so, as in, you know, the ideological space is opened up and within the left, and therefore the left would make major advances. I think it has been evident that that hasn't been the case. So I think that is something to bear in mind. In actual fact, it led to mass disillusionment of people who had illusions in the Soviet Union, but also the broader left, because it didn't just affect the populations within these countries. Being from Germany originally, the DDR, the East German deformed worker state, and its collapse had a direct negative impact on the working conditions in the West, because they described the deformed worker state in the East as the third man on the table whenever there were trade union negotiations, because they provided a certain material, they provided certain material benefits to the working class in the East that you couldn't fall below, because otherwise workers in the West would be attracted to the state in the East. And when that fell apart, it was actually social democracy in the West that rode through the harshest cutback programs against the working class in the West as well. So, so in that sense, that's why I think in the new Cold War, workers have to have a side in defense of the collectivized property forms that we still have in China. But it doesn't mean alignment with the CCP. What it means is that we have to build and establish revolutionary internationalist workers' organizations internationally, which can hamper potentially the war mobilizations against China to the extent that they happen today by strikes. It's not impossible. In the US in 2007, there was a strike, one-day strike, so more symbolic than factual, but against the war in Iraq, where the ILWU went on strike and shut down the ports and prevented the delivery of weaponry to US troops in Iraq. But also in China, as I said, with a perspective for the Chinese proletariat of political proletarian revolution to open the door to a more credible long-term perspective towards genuine communism.
Mike, did you have something to say?
Yes, try not to do too much. I mean, I agree with Hans-Peter there. I think that's a very good idea. We can align ourselves with certain ideas and the idea of collectivized property, etc. But it would be a disaster to identify with a post-capitalist state as the way forward towards that. And certainly with the party that is the vehicle of that. When the Soviet Union did collapse, why did people stop believing in the idea of the worker state? Because it was identified, Soviet Union was identified with the worker state, with socialism, right? And who connived at that? Well, somebody like Leon Trotsky, right? Who said this is a degenerated worker state and all we need is a political revolution. So he identified the thing as on halfway there. And it seems to me that Carl Davison is saying, yes, they have aspirations and they're on their way, and let's not be negative and depressed, etc. Well, I say, I look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party and I don't see a valuing of workers' democracy or internationalism. Now, people can argue with that, but I think that's what we have to argue about. I don't want China to collapse. I want it to change, just as I want the capitalist countries to change as well. And they can only do that by rejecting the idea that these worker states, whether Russia or China, were the hope for the future. The hope for the future is in working class democracy and internationalism. Thank you.
Kevin?
Sure, I'll be super brief since we're over time. Yeah, I think in thinking about post-capitalism, others have mentioned, China is alternative. In some way, it is to the U.S. or American hegemony. But the question is, what kind of alternative it is? The fact that it is alternative, it doesn't mean it's a good alternative. And of course, well, obviously, we also need to separate, the Chinese state from the Chinese working class or Chinese people in general, right? They're not the same, even though the Chinese Communist Party does have tens of millions of membership. We do have to look at it closely. How many of those members are actually believer of some genuine version of socialism and communism, and how many of them join the Communist Party to advance their career? So I think taking seriously the question of what China is, and I think none of us on this panel, and I guess in the audience too, obviously want want to attack China or for China to collapse. I don't think that's a good idea, obviously, and that will be disaster for my own families and friends. Many of whom are in China. But I think looking at China critically, looking at Chinese state critically, and looking at Chinese capitalism critically, I think that's an important task. I think this is a very fraught time. That's where I end my talk at, is that I think because of the US-China conflict, people tend to look at China somewhat in a rosy or less critical view, because, obviously people, leftists based in the US, your first task is to oppose American imperialism. And I fully agree with that. But it doesn't necessarily mean endorsing Chinese capitalism as alternative. And again, I think others have brought up, for example, I think Carl very respectfully brought up, there are, communist parties not monolithic. There are different factions and different views within, and I agree with that. But I do not see change come from within the party itself. I would still look at the workers. And again, most of the workers, I haven't really seen workers making explicit demand to overthrow the party or the state. They're mostly about economic demands and some kind of worker representation at the factory level. That's kind of extended demands for the last about 20 years. There's no workers' demand to overthrow the state, as far as we can tell. And correct me if I'm wrong. So I think that's where we have to take that into account and look at what's happening on the ground to workers and working class. And I think take cues from them rather than from the party structure or the bureaucracy or the state. I think that's a dead end for any progressive social movement or socialist politics.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to all of our panelists for this discussion. We'll have it up on YouTube pretty soon, and we'll be sending it around to all of you. Reflecting on the American left, in an hour, we'll be having a panel on what was Occupy. And I thank you all very much again. Claps.
Thank you.